Good morning. Welcome to our class together. Today we're finishing our small overview of the book of Luke. So today I wanted to begin class by asking a question. A question I think is important to ask. That is, how do you convince someone of that which seems to be impossible? Now let me try to explain that. We all know that in 1969, Americans stepped foot on the moon. We've known that for 50 years. However, let's assume that you were to go to a jungle in Brazil. Those who inhabited that jungle had no connection with television. They didn't have newspapers. They were pretty much illiterate. But around a campfire, they would look up and they would see the moon, and you would visit them and say to them, "Did you know that men have walked up there?" And they would look at you like, "Are you crazy? Men don't go there, men are here." That little experiment, that little problem that we would have trying to explain to them something that we know is factual, something that we know has happened, but they don't, is what the problem is that we want to look at in this lesson. Because when Luke writes his gospel, he is writing to people who have no conception of the resurrection, for instance. In fact, for the mind of the Greek, they would believe that men come and go, they die, but they don't come back to life. They never met anybody like that. They never had experience with it. So what do you say to them? So that's what we're going to examine today as we look at the Gospel of Luke as he deals with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. But first of all, let's talk about the Greek experience. The Greeks had an experience with life that was pretty much secular. That's what we would call it. They lived and they died. The only thing they knew was human existence here on earth. And when someone died, they knew where they were. They knew where the body was laid. They knew they could visit the tomb. For instance, all the great philosophers had a tomb. Aristotle, the great philosopher who wrote the Ethics, his tomb is still available to see today in Greece. The same could be said about Socrates, the great philosopher who developed the Socratic method of questioning everything. Now, those are men that the Greeks would have compared Jesus to because they were great moral teachers, and many of them saw Jesus as a great moral teacher, perhaps, much like our modern conception of what people think today when they're in a secular world. Jesus is great. I just can't believe him. It's kind of a strange idea. But they would go to Plato and they would go to Aristotle and Socrates, and they would find graves, and they say, "Here's these graves. We know they have died and they are buried." More than that, they had a conception that was very dark and melancholy about death. They had no concept that men could come back to life, that there was anything beyond the grave. You were like the little dog Rover, that when you were dead all over. For instance, from the grave of Sakos of Eutrapus, there is this inscription: "Shine while you live, blaze beyond grief, for life is brief and time a thief." Not a lot of hope in that statement. The same could be said about an inscription that was imprinted on the grave of Antipater Sidon. It says, "Everywhere the sea is the sea, the dead are the dead. What difference to me where I rest my head? The sea knows I'm buried." Again, where is hope for a different life, a new life, an afterlife, a life with God, a life with heaven? None of that is there. So in the back of the Greek mind, there's all of these things going on as you start to talk about things like the resurrection. In fact, when the preaching of the resurrection took place in the first century to Greek audiences, they had lots of trouble hearing it. It didn't seem to fit with what they knew to be true. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul says to the Corinthians in a very Greek city, We preach Christ crucified. Then he goes on to say, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. Foolishness, that's the word that we get our English word moron from. You're moronic. You're empty-headed if you believe that someone comes back from the dead. That's how the Greeks thought about it. The same could be said about when Paul goes to Athens in Acts chapter 17. He does quite well among the Epicureans and the Stoics as he explains to them what he was preaching, this unknown God that they seem to worship in ignorance. He did quite well until he got to the resurrection. It says, for he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. And then Luke goes on to say, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered. They mocked Paul. Really? What kind of an idiot do you think he is that he believes that people come back from the grave? And so you have the mind of the Greek who has no conception, no idea that death leads anywhere but the grave, and the grave is permanent, and there is no resurrection, and there is no new life. And yet the centrality of Christianity is Jesus was died for our sins, was buried in a grave, and raised to a new life, and we can identify with and join him in that. But one of the things we need to remember is that the preaching always preceded the proof. Now, let me explain. We have this weird idea, and people have never said it quite this way, but they think it. They believe the Gospels were like diaries. That every night before they would go to bed, the diarist, whether it be Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, would sit down and say, today, this is what Jesus did. This is what he said. This is what he taught. Here were the people around. Here's what the reaction was. And therefore, it was all available to people when the preaching of the apostles started taking place after the day of Pentecost. We have gotten so accustomed to having a Bible in front of us in some form that a preacher can say, turn to, and we can look at it while he's talking to say, I can see it for myself, that we can't even imagine a time that people didn't do that. But in the first century, they didn't, because the Gospels were written closer to the end of the lives of the apostles, after the preaching had taken place. When the eyewitnesses start to disappear, when they start to die off, they write down the things that they remembered, that they have heard, and it's been delivered to them, so they will not be lost. The eyewitness testimony is still here. It's just in a different form. But it didn't exist when Peter mounted the pulpit on Pentecost, or Paul goes on his first missionary journey. He didn't distribute paperback copies of the New International Version or the English Standard Version. He didn't pass out scrolls, didn't have them. And so it's good to go through the experience, I think, of saying, what was being said to these people that was swirling around in their minds from the preaching of the apostles? First of all, if you start in the book of Acts, now Acts is written by Luke in secondhand, but he's now describing what was said that was part of the Greek experience. There in the first chapter of Acts, Jesus is about to ascend back into heaven, and he gives them this idea. He tells the disciples these things. He says, power will come upon you, and you will be my witnesses. Key word. Someone saw something happen. In Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria, that part of the world that was not being accepted by the Jews, and to the ends of the earth. No matter who you were going to be able to hear the gospel. That included the Greeks that Luke writes to. But when you go through this, you also come to, for instance, the day of Pentecost. The day of Pentecost, the sermon that Peter has to, the sermon Peter preaches, his is filled with these little tidbits of things that are have to be dealt with later. He says this man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him on the cross, but God raised him from the dead. Think about what that says. God had a plan. Jesus was part of that plan, and he died on a cross but was raised from the dead. This is what Gentiles were hearing during that period of time, but they had no conception of it. And you go a little further in Peter's sermon, Acts 2, he says, for fellow Israelites, I can tell you confidently that patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is here to this day. That was the Greek experience too. They had the Platos, they had the Socrateses, they had the Aristotles. They could go to their graves, much like the Jews could go to David. You see, there's a grave with a body in it. But Peter continued by saying, therefore, let the house of Israel know this for certain, that God has made him both Lord and Christ. Now, that's significant for two reasons. For one basic reason that I'm going to use here. There are a lot of reasons for it. But what's significant is that when Peter preaches that sermon, he preaches it and he uses two terms for Jesus. Lord, which is a very Jewish term, the Adonai experience. Second is a Greek word, Christos. He is anointed for the Greeks as well as the Jews. There's something important in that when the Greeks would hear it, their ears would pop up and say, I hear something that relates to me. Well, let's go forward. In Acts chapter 10, you meet Peter as he crosses the threshold to the Gentile Cornelius. He goes to his house, and you know the whole story. We won't repeat all that. But what he tells Cornelius and these other Greeks in the room is significant, as Luke tells it. But to us who have been chosen by God as witnesses, who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead, and everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name. Now let's unpack that for just a moment. They are witnesses of the fact. Nobody's making this up. They're just telling what they've seen. But the second thing is, when Jesus rose from the dead, they ate and drank with him. You don't do that with a corpse. You have to be alive to do that. Think about if you didn't know anything about resurrection and suddenly a man who has died comes back to life and you eat and drink with, you have to make some assumptions about reality at that point. And it's the forgiveness of sins available to all, anyone who believes in him, even those who are not Jewish. But let's go on further. In Acts chapter 17, there is an incident. And the incident is when Paul preaches in Thessalonica, he irritates the Jews because he is giving the invitation to the Gentiles as well. And they are jealous because the Gentiles are going to Paul and not coming to the synagogue. And so it says that the Jews took some wicked men of the rabbis and they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them, meaning Paul and his party, out to the crowd. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city's authorities, saying, these men who have turned the world upside down have come here also, and Jason has received them. And listen to this, they are acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. The popular conception being floated about Jesus, especially by the Jews, was Jesus was a seditionist. He was a rebel who was executed on the cross because he deserved it, because he was guilty. And these people are holding on to that idea. The Greeks would hear all these things in their minds. They would hear them in the street. They would hear them from the Jews. They would hear them in the shops. They would have to ask the question, how is it that someone who is innocent would die on a cross and then be raised to life again? They had nothing in their experience to say anything about that. So, how does Luke's gospel speak to the skepticism of the Greeks who listened to this preaching? Let's dig in a little bit, briefly at least this morning. There's a lot here, so it won't be too long. But I want to give you a track through some of this as we look at the parallel passages, and I'll try to direct your attention as we can. For instance, let's start with the Lord's Supper. All the three of the Synoptic Gospels talk about the Lord's Supper. But it's interesting that Luke says some things that are just a hair different. Now, we won't get into all of those, but the one I wanted to bring your attention to today is Luke chapter 23, verse 17. As Jesus has distributed the cup, most of the time says, "This is the blood of my covenant. Take, drink of it." But Luke says, "Take this and divide it among yourselves." The cup of the covenant is distributed to everyone. It is not for one, but for all. Now, that may be a small thing, but it will become very important to the preaching of the gospel. So let's go on. The betrayal, all of them, all the gospels, all three gospels, talk about Jesus predicting his betrayal by one of his own. And you read about it in Mark chapter 14 and Matthew chapter 26, but in Luke chapter 22, in verses 21 through 23, Luke talks about it, but he adds one thing. See, most of the time, these people are beginning to say to Jesus, "Is it I?" Luke adds something to that. And they begin to question one another, which of them it could be that was going to do this. When Luke writes his gospel, he describes to a T what the common experience would be. You would turn to the fellow next to you and wonder suspiciously, is he going to be the one that does it? And you might whisper that to him. Or what about him over there across the room? You know him. You think he's the one? That's a very common experience for people. And it was something that Luke brought out. This was a real event that was taking place, not something made up. But he goes on to say that when you talk about Peter's going to deny Christ. All three Gospels admit that. One thing, though, is highly significant in Luke's Gospel. In Luke chapter 22, 31 to 32, it says that Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. What's interesting is the role that Simon played. And in fact, it's interesting that Luke doesn't use the term Peter, he uses the word Simon. It's very Greek. That's his Greek name. Um, Simon, 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 you're going to be tested. You're going to be sifted like wheat to find out what's chaff and what's real. And to try to separate the bad from the good. You are going to go through this cleansing experience. But out of that, you'll turn back again and you're going to strengthen the brothers. It was going to reinforce the preaching of Peter in the first century. When they begin to talk about Peter on the day of Pentecost or Peter going to Cornelius, this part of this would help tell that story that Peter's preaching was important for various reasons, one of which is he's the one who has been sifted like wheat. But then they go to Gethsemane. And again, all three of the Gospels tell the story of Gethsemane. But it's what Luke highlights that I want you to see today. It says in Luke chapter 23, 22, 43 to 44, and there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Luke, the physician, takes great aim at the detail. He is very much suffering. This is really true agony. To the point he needs divine assistance. And when the sweat breaks out of his brow, it drips in heavy, full drops like blood does. This is something that has reality to it, has grit to it. It's not a story, it's an event. And then we come to the accusations made against Jesus. The trials of Jesus are well documented in all three Gospels. It is what Luke highlights that I think is important. The first is in Luke chapter 23 and verse 2. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding them to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ the King." Have you heard that accusation somewhere? That's exactly what the Jews were saying in Thessalonica, that Jesus was a seditionist. He made himself a king. He's opposing Caesar and the decrees of Caesar. He's nothing more than a common criminal. There's the accusation. That's one of the accusations being made throughout the first century. When the preaching of Jesus comes, those who oppose it are going to bring that one up. And so Luke puts it there. Here's the accusation they're making against him. But then he goes on. What happened with that? He's one that goes into great detail exclusively about the results. In Luke chapter 23, 6 to 12, it says, when Pilate heard this, that the man was a Galilean, he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, so he sent him to Herod. Herod wanted a cheap trick, you may remember, and it says that the chief priests and the scribes stood by vehemently accusing him, and Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him, then arrayed him in splendorous clothing. He sent him back to Pilate. When he comes back to Pilate, in verse 13, Pilate says, he called together the chief priests and elders of the people, rulers of the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who is misleading the people. After examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of the charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him." You see, when the accusation is made, Luke says he was thoroughly examined by Pilate, by Herod, and together two magistrates, two rulers came to the conclusion he's not guilty of what you say he's guilty of. He's innocent of these charges. Jesus will die as an innocent man. Anyone who wants to make him out to be a criminal doesn't know the record, is what Luke is trying to say. So examine the records. As time moved on, Jesus would be put to death. He would be paraded through the streets carrying his cross. With him, though, it's Luke, as we saw last week, has a great affinity toward the downtrodden, including women who were marginalized at that time. And so, and several things that we saw last week, that the oral tradition said you don't even talk to a woman. It was even your wife in public. But Luke puts the women there, women who were following him. And there followed him a great multitude of people and of women who were mourning and lamenting for him. But Jesus turned and said, he's talking to women, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. And he goes on to talk about the distress that's going to come. Luke says, Jesus to the very end was telling people something is going to happen, that they need to pay attention, even to the women. But that continues as well. Jesus dies on the cross, and he dies, but there are two others that die on that cross, those crosses. Thieves, one on each side. We know that story. All three Gospels tell us that story. Now, if you tell that story to someone, I bet you're going to include something. It says in Luke chapter 23, 40 to 43, but the other rebuked him, the other thief rebuked him, saying, do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. And he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. I think it's sad that we have turned this into a theological football, that we miss the real importance of it. Even the guilty knew Jesus was innocent. And the guilty, even there, appealed to him to give them something they needed desperately. Is that not a plea for all men, but especially the Gentiles? We deserve what we get, but you don't. Save us. That would be the plea that's being made. Then what do you do about the resurrection? Remember, Greeks had a real problem with resurrection. It didn't make any sense to them. It seemed to be moronic and empty-headed to think that way, unless it was true. How do you know it's true? Well, in Luke chapter 24, Luke builds this quiet case, the resurrection. The story's told in the gospel, all three gospels, but the way Luke includes various things tells you what he's trying to get across. First, there is the witness of the women again. In Luke chapter 24 and verse 10, it says, now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and other women who were with him, who told these things to the apostles, meaning that he had been raised from the dead and there was no body in the tomb. But the word seemed to them, to the disciples, as an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter rose and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home marveling at what had happened. Those are all the same things the Greeks might say. These are just idle words. I don't want to believe that. And Luke says, fine. One of those who did that, who was Peter, and he went and he examined carefully. That's what those words mean, to stoop and to look in. He's taking some great pains to find this out. And he sees the linen laying there, something that doesn't happen. When there's linen there, there's a body with it. And he went home marveling what had happened. That's a mirror of the Greek experience. I don't believe it because it seemed like a tale. But if you'll examine it, there's more to it. And Luke wants to say there is more to it. So he takes us to the road to Emmaus. The road to Emmaus story has always fascinated me. It's one of those stories that's found only in Luke, and it has a charm of its own. I mean, I find it just this very interesting what it says and what it really means. But you know what the story of the road to Emmaus is. It's the story about Jesus showing up and these men are talking among themselves as they're making this journey to Emmaus, roughly about 7/10 of a mile. And as they talk, they're talking about the current events in Jerusalem. The current events in Jerusalem are that someone died on a cross, and it's being said that the tomb is empty, and they all wonder what happened to the body. Sounds very much like what the Greeks might be thinking. And Jesus joins them and says, "What are you talking about?" And they said, "Well, don't you know these things? You're a stranger here." And he says, "What things?" So he lets them explain it. And it says, concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and with all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he would be the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all that, it is now the third day since these things have happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, came back saying that they had seen the vision of angels who said that he was alive. The first part of the story is this is what the bare events are of the story. This is what people were saying about Jesus. That's the thumbnail sketch. That the women went, they saw something, they said they saw a vision of angels. We don't know what to make out of it. Let's continue. Jesus says, "O foolish ones, slow of heart to believe what the prophets have spoken." And he begins to open the scriptures to them and tell the things concerning himself. And when they drew near the village of Emmaus, they said, "Stay with us, because it's evening, the day is now spent." So he went in and he stayed with them. And when he was at table with them, he took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. And then it says, and their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And he vanished from their sight. And they said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, when he opened to us the scriptures?" And they rose at the same hour, returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, saying, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." Then they told him what happened on the road and how he was known to them and the breaking of the bread. That is a very Greek experience. We don't know what to make out of these things. But when we began to examine it, our eyes were opened. He was raised from the dead. And then his final words. Luke kind of has a parallel between Acts 1 and Luke chapter 24, 44 to 47. But one thing I just want to bring out very briefly about the final words of Christ, and that is, it talks about that this is written that the Christ should suffer and on the third day rise from the dead. That's the basic preaching of the gospel. And that repentance for the forgiveness of sins should be proclaimed in his name to all the nations. The Greeks, the Gentiles, are part of the plan of God. So what does Luke bring out? We're going to just kind of pull these things together. First of all, the death, burial, and resurrection were the plan of God. They weren't man's concoction. This was not a hallucination. This was not a set of coincidences turned into a tale. This was a deliberate plan. And God had had it far before anybody was ever born. The accusations against Jesus were false. He was not a seditionist. Even though the Jews, even in the days of the teachings of the apostles, said that. He was not, the accusations were false. And in fact, no one found any guilt in him. Neither Herod nor Pilate found anything justifying his death. But he died anyway, as an innocent. When they went to the tomb on the third day, it was empty, and there were many people who saw it. The women, they all had names. You can check them out. There's Peter, who takes great pains looking in, checking out, getting the evidence, and who marvels at what he sees or doesn't see, perhaps, more than anything else. And then those who did not know him personally spoke and ate with him after his death. You don't speak and eat with people who are dead. Only those who were alive. Resurrection had to happen because he was with live people who could tell the difference between life and death. They were not having hallucinations. It never happened at the same time. It happened to different people, different places. Finally, he was sent to the entire world. The plan of God was worldwide, encompassing every human being, every tongue, every race, including those who were hearing the gospel that Jesus died on the cross, buried in a tomb, but was raised the third day. And you can believe that. So for Luke, he asked us and them this question: can you believe the unbelievable? That's what the gospel is about. You thought about that? It's believing the unbelievable. That men do rise from the dead. That there is forgiveness of sins. That there is freedom. That there is a heaven. All those things you can't see. You have to believe them. Can you believe the unbelievable? Thank you for joining me. Next week, there will not be a recorded class. I am taking a week of vacation during the Thanksgiving holiday. And because of that, I am decided not to do anything that week except just enjoy life for a while and take a rest. And so next week, if you want to, the lesson was going to be very simple, and that is review and listen to some, or go back and think, what did I learn through this series? And I hope you'll do that as kind of a way to put it all together. And I'll be back with you the next week with a new series on the Gospel of John called That You May Believe. So thank you for joining me. I'm glad you were with me. I enjoyed our study together today. You go out and have a great day.